Thank you all. Right. In many ways, this is a part two. Part one was Julio eloquently explaining some of our basic methodology to what we're doing. And I get the privilege today to say what we did and what we're currently doing with that methodology. Our study, funded by TRT, is named Spiritual Understanding and Architecture, a multi-method empirical investigation across religious and non-religious populations. I'm a big fan of the Victorian era subtitle and the gloriousness of that. So you can see that there's real depth to what that is. As TRT has charged us with, we are looking to test aesthetic cognitivism at the highest level. Right? We're asking questions. Is there an empirically demonstrable connection between aesthetic experience and understanding? What distinctive cognitive value does engagement with the arts generate? And is beauty essential to understanding, and does beautiful art have special advantages? These are the kind of questions swirling around all of our TRT investigations, coming from different fields and different areas of connection. And to recall Julio's eloquent presentation, we are anchoring our work in Bomberger's cognitive contributions of art, of which he offers 7 ways that art has a unique contribution to cognitive understanding. One of which is categories, new ways of classifying, perspectives, reframing how we see, questions, provoking deeper inquiry, phenomenal knowledge, or an experiential understanding that's there, thought experiments, imagine possibilities, Gordon spoke about. We can read a book and imagine these different thought experiments, practicing emotions, grasping connections or linking ideas, and cognitive improvement, strengthening perceptions. Now we recognize, although as architects, we think architects will and can save the world and it's the greatest art there has ever been, we do recognize there's a bit of a limitation there, that we can't necessarily, in architecture, handle or cover or successfully do all 7 of these. So we've taken a smaller focus on this, yet still ambitious, looking at 3. We're looking at how is it that sacred architecture or architecture in general, beautiful spaces, can speak to perspectives, sense-making, perspective-taking, existential realization, phenomenal knowledge and self-transcendence, awe, mystery, compassion, those kind of elements, and then grasping connections, new meanings, use, service, liturgy. So that's essentially how we're founding some of our study, and this is really not just the first. This is the 3rd of these types of inquiries, also providing a framing. Julio and Yoshi and others of the team carried out a couple other studies before this one, the first of which looked at what we'd say the effect. What kind of effect does aesthetic spaces have on people? It was a neurophenomenological study. And then phase 2 said, well, what was that cause? That's being a little bombastic with that language because we can't find that cause directly, but that's essentially what we're hinting at. What of the architecture was making some of this effect? So in that was an inclusion and addition to eye tracking software as well as biometric measuring of the human, attempting to track what we're seeing and what we're feeling. Now for this larger study, we carried forward those 2 ideas, but we also began asking for whom? And to do so, we linked what I would say beautifully together as we are in this room between East Coast and West Coast, between Protestant and Catholic, and tying some of our skill sets together to bring this to life. To do so, our basic high level research methodology here is we have a population of 180 individuals, 60 Catholics, 60 Protestants, and 60 non-religious. There was a pretty strict screener to get into our study. The screener included Santa Clarita's religious intensity measures. They had a score of 30 or above, so these are very intent religious practicing individuals. They had to self-identify as Christian, identify within that. Also, if you were in the non-religious category, we limited people who even grew up in the church when they were youth and no longer in the church. So these were truly non-religious for the extent of their life. We also had screeners that they couldn't have visited our building sites. So they didn't have any kind of preconceived notion of what these buildings are and so forth. So it's a pretty tight selected. The fully crossed group, 18 to 70, exact male, female, across different kind of measures within that. Now, I did not recruit all those individuals. One of the gloriousness of some funding is we were able to have a participant recruitment company make sure all of our demographics were really spot on with this. As you can imagine, this was a large endeavor. To make it even more of a large endeavor, we decided to move out of the laboratory and go into the wild to get that real architectural experience. So we did this across 3 buildings. We took each person and took them through Christ Cathedral, Eastside Christian Church, and Orange County Museum of the Arts. So those of you statisticians in the room, this is about 540 experimental sessions in the wild. It was a large task to do this. As we know, as Anjan so eloquently showed us, in the wild creates all kinds of variables that you wouldn't necessarily imagine. One of which, it rains in California, which we didn't realize until you have very expensive equipment and you have to cancel a bunch of participant sessions so the equipment doesn't get drenched. Right, these things happen with that. I want to make a nod to Jacob Slagle back there, who is not only helping us here, but was the research manager for all of this chaos. A wonderful, wonderful job. We are carrying 9 research assistants plus Slagle, plus managing participant recruitment companies across access and permission to these sacred spaces. It was a tall endeavor, for sure. And to Jacob's credit, we finished early. Yeah, that's it. Praise God. Yeah. Wes, this is where we really see the movement of the Spirit happening within that. Yeah, research tactics, we pulled a lot of the methodology forward that were beta tested in the previous studies. So we worked with eye tracking glasses, we worked with biometric measures. And for those of you interested in how all this works, Slagle is going to have a show and tell after this session to show how all the equipment works and how we actually set all that up, if you're interested in that. And then we also paired that with phenomenological surveys afterwards. So these are the buildings. In each building, we established 6 different stops. People would come to the site, first one being Christ Cathedral, second one being Eastside, which is a typical evangelical Protestant warehouse church, and then the Art Museum here in Orange County. These are all modern style architecture to contrast with the DC studies, which are more classical architecture. So at some point, when we sleep a little bit more, we can do some cross studies all the way through. But in this case, there are 6 stops, 1 at the beginning, 1 right at the entry into the narthex kind of entry hall area, then released into the main space, and then a secondary view of the main space. After experiencing that main space for a while, they get an understanding, first impression and understanding of the space, and then back out to the front so they can see if their perception of the building has changed since that. Each person in the protocol would be asked to stop for 60 seconds at each one of these locations to help their biometrics kind of rest, to get a large gaze at the building, track their eyes in a stationary position, and then we were able to ask phenomenological questions at that particular mark. What I'm about to share with you is, I would argue, 1/20th of the data that we've just begun to mine. We have millions of lines of data that we're going through. We've got a great research team. Thank you, Amir, for working on some of this. And a couple others, Dr. Lee, working on this. We have some I'm calling these very preliminary results. So we met as a research team on Thursday. Raise your hand if you're on the research team. They're your MCs for the week. Thank you so much for all your work here. We're doing the preliminary understanding and narrative building and kind of data interpretation at this point. We're about right at halfway through our grant. So let me give you some preliminary observations. And I mark these very loosely as observations because we're simply looking at the graphs for the first time. Although these are all statistically run in the background, as architects, we like to look at things in pictures. So as we began to take individuals through this and then look at the data after, we notice even just from a beginning first view, a striking observation. Help you understand here, light blue, top line is Catholics, the maroon color is going to be a Protestant, and then the green color is going to be non-religious. We'll always present it in the Catholic building, the Protestant building, and the non-religious building. You'll notice here that this is aesthetic engagement. When they're coming into the building, through the building, they're asking how much beauty do you perceive in these particular spots. Each mark is stop 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to get a sense throughout the building. And you'll notice, even from a very basic observation, the shape is the same. I'll mention at this point, as we look through the stats, gender was not statistically significant, age was not statistically significant, and neither was building order visit statistically significant. So we're really looking at the building as the major effect in this. So you'll see the interpretation of this is Catholics and Protestants, and just to a lesser intensity, non-religious, are experiencing the building and understanding beauty in the same way, even across all the measures. Also interesting to note that you'll see the Christ Cathedral is understood as much more beautiful than our warehouse church, but yet we can see the art museum coming here. Now, this is like a baseline. How do we understand people understanding beauty here? And then we can see how that correlates as we move forward. But it's interesting as you begin digging in, beauty is understood relatively similar, but some of the interpretation as we move to the eye tracking varies. You can begin to see that as, for example, as the Catholics come into the Christ Cathedral, their primary 60 people are staring at the altar, and that's it. You move over to the Protestants, we're beginning to look at the altar, the organ, the art, right, kind of bouncing between the religious symbolism. And then you come over to the non-religious, and it's a bit scattered. Not really a pre-filter to understand where to look in some of this. These are heat maps of eye tracking, precognitive eye tracking measures within that, yeah. So an aggregate of 60 participants in each. So we begin to say we have a shared experience, but in many ways we're beginning to interpret these through different frameworks. And we're seeing that show up in exit surveys and other phenomenological survey work, red Catholic, blue Protestant, gray non-religious. This is ranked by Protestants. There's about 40 of these. This is just one example, not even just necessarily say what's here, but we have this data. And we begin to see things like there's openness to sacredness, but yet the non-religious are seeing that as mystery and awe versus spirituality, right? And how do we begin to understand that? Again, a lot of questions we're working through as a research team. But ultimately, as I said from the beginning, we're trying to look at perspectives, phenomenological knowledge, and grasping connections. So a couple samples of this. We begin to move from beauty to asking about awe or mystery, right, that's there. And we can begin to see, if you remember from the last graphs, just flash back in your mind, there's a very strong correlation in shape, in intensity, and what that looks like. So there's this correlated, which shouldn't shock any of us in here, this correlation between beauty and awe, right, kind of a baseline for us. But then it becomes interesting as you begin to ask in what way or at what point and how much of these spaces compel you to consider life's meaning in this perspective taking. And we can begin to see, even just visually, although statistically there too, the more beautiful a space is, the more compelled people are to consider life's meaning. Now we see this in different intensities, right? We see the Christian populations versus the non-religious population. But it's important to note that it happens universally across everybody. It's also important to note we're not just talking about, well, that's a cathedral. Of course you're going to consider life meaning there versus a warehouse or an art museum. More importantly, we're seeing this within building itself. So within the cathedral itself, those places are less aesthetically intense, are causing less meaning making or desire for meaning than in that. And that's happening in all cases. Now, we don't have all the graphs up here but just one side note, which is, I don't think I have it. All right, let me look. Nope. We can begin to see here as a side note for our evangelicals in the room, the peak moment walking into this space is number 4. You can see this here. We can see this here. But yet we should see this here. But we end up seeing, as we see number 5 in the evangelical church, the story behind this. When you walk into the evangelical auditorium, although it's a warehouse, there is a lot of, oh man, like gasp, awe, this is big, the scale is amazing. Fortunately, if any of you have been into an evangelical church, we know that it's really a bit of a warehouse, but if you turn on all the lights, it's not what it's meant to be. Right? So we were fortunate enough to work with the tech team, have the lights and the house lights down and the light show going on the stage with the video screen, so we had more of a real experience of what an evangelical church would feel like. So when they walk into 4, they're immediately captured by the light show on the stage and the video projections and things. But interesting, when you move to 5, you come to the other side of the auditorium. And on the eye tracking, what you begin to see is the light stage here, but all the eyes over here in the shadows. And if you pull away that marker, or all the analysis markers that are there, they're in the shadows to the side of the stage with no lights on it, moving lights, projections have no lights on it over here. is one simple cross, the only piece of religious symbolism in the entire church. And that one simple cross is bumping us in all of our measures between beauty, awe, compelling for meaning, and as we move forward beyond perspectives to grasping connections, how much do we feel connected to Christian beliefs? Again, mapping in the same direction, seeing that number 5 bump for the evangelicals. Less intensity, again, by the non-religious compared to the religious. And then we also begin asking, we asked other things, but that's all I have today for that. So there's these interesting narratives coming out of this. And again, not a lot of this may be shocking to some of us in the room, but we're seeing it in arguably the largest in real life survey of architecture. We haven't found anybody else that's attempted 540 sessions, foolishly attempted 540 sessions. That aesthetic and beautiful spaces or aesthetic intense spaces are acting like an amplifier to desire for meaning or search for meaning or that. Now the volume is a little higher for others than others, but it's amplifying all of that. And then we find spaces, preliminary observations, spaces that are a bit more symbolically thick are actually directing that desire for meaning in a particular way. We've got a question I'm showing up here, I'm sorry, that's like how much do I want to be connected with the faith? How much am I seeking the faith? And spaces with symbolic thickness seem to direct that openness to meaning in a particular way, where we don't necessarily see that in others, it gets scattered within that. So roughly speaking, we see that there's this aesthetic quality and intensity leading to the shared perceptual response, leading to cognitive activation, and then this worldview filtering off of that. But we do know here, even from early observations, that beautiful spaces are increasing attention and awe, that these increases correlating with higher compelled sense to consider life's meaning and connection with the faith. And this felt connection to and communication of Christian faith rises in proportion to perceived beauty where symbolic cues are strong. And then this background worldview shapes intensity, but not necessarily direction of that. So what do we take from this after looking at 1/10 of the data? Many more. We don't have any of the physiological data yet, and we're still working through the piles of other data. But I think we can safely say, in some ways, suggest perhaps, that beautiful spaces open people to deeper questions about meaning and faith. It's maybe one narrative coming out of this, out of maybe 10 by the end of it all. So we go back and we ask some of the TRT questions. Is there an empirically demonstrable connection between aesthetic experience and understanding? Yeah, we do see measurable links between more beautiful spaces and deeper engagement with meaning and consideration of the spiritual faith. Much more nuance to come, much more flavor to come after this. But a huge thanks to the team, not only for the last 1.5 years, but the 1.5 years to come of data analysis and publications here, but a wonderful team that's here assembled, plus a large RA team underneath this. So thank you guys.
When you go to that, to the last, I want to say one thing. We'll keep going back to the diagram. Yeah, just the diagram, to the one behind. Just a couple of things here. One, notice that there is a statistical significance between the Christian group and the non-religious group. A significance. So despite our differences between Catholics and there is a lot in common. That's statistically significant. We've done statistics, and that's one thing. The second thing, notice that even the location on the graph, that the Christ Cathedral achieved at every time high ratings. Mm-hmm. That's and the last one here, of course, there is no Christian message intended at all in the museum. I mean, there is no intention. Yeah. Yet people find meaning there through Christianity, which is kind of what I think Gordon was talking. You're bringing your hat, you're bringing your beliefs. So whatever is speaking, you speak into your faith.
Yeah, and what Paul was talking about earlier today about this, how we have this sacramental universe that we're, depending on the language of your tradition, we become sanctified more into. Yeah. Our eyes become more open, right? And so we see that, at least from that Christian interpretation view. So.
Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you all.
Yeah, sorry, I just interrupted.
Yeah, well, your face is right here, so you're.
The next is Robin Jensen.
So I'm going to describe what is like a two-part process of almost 7 years of working with Templeton money. and some sort of two sections of what we were working on. I will say, first of all, some of you already know this, I'm actually I was in the theology department at the University of Notre Dame. And I also connected to the School of Architecture a little bit, art history mostly, as well as theology, where I also teach the history of Christian liturgy. So I'm this person, and I was teamed up with two cognitive scientists from our psych department, Jim Brockmel, who is a specialist in vision and eye tracking and perception, and Gabriel Radvansky, whose specialization is in memory studies. And so we were a little bit of an odd team because many times they had to interpret things for me about what cognitive scientists do. And I had to interpret things about what theologians think about. So I was telling in the car, I kept saying, what do you really mean by event structure? And then they say, well, what do you really mean by Lent? So, we had to work this out. But this began with the three interesting questions or foci that I'm going to try to do in sequence. One is the temporal effect of, this is the title of our thing, the effect of temporal context, congruent or incongruent temporal context on memory for or experience of sacred art styles and subject matter. So this is really about art and not architecture. That'd be one thing to say. The second thing is about spatial context. So the question I really began with is what happens when you take a piece of art and you move it from a sacred context, like a chapel or a church, and you move it to a museum. And how do viewers encounter and assess the artwork differently if they do? So I always wondered if you could actually push a prie-dieu up in front of a crucifix in a museum, invite people to pray, or whether you'd get thrown out of the museum if you tried to do that. So that's where we started. So I'm going to start with the temporal context first. So for this study, given that our sample comes from a largely Roman Catholic population, we used religious practices that occur throughout the calendar year to operationalize temporal context into two religious seasons, Lent and ordinary time. To do this, we explored different levels of memory retention, namely, first, memory for perceptual details of the art. Secondly, memory for inferential understandings of the art, or gist. And third, autobiographical memories for the initial experience of the art. We didn't have a strong prediction for how artistic style would be influenced by temporal context, but we were going to look at this as well. Thus, analysis involving these factors were more exploratory first. On one hand, because representational art more directly conveys to viewers the depicted events and elicits stronger emotional reactions, we expected that processing such pieces would be more influenced by congruent temporal context. On the other hand, because abstract or non-representational art requires more effort to understand, that is, it requires more mental effort from the viewer to understand how the work refers to its label, we expected that the processing of such pieces would be more influenced by congruent temporal context. So in other words, if you see abstract art in Lent, you're going to see it a little bit differently than you would in ordinary time. So to test this, we assessed experience of and memory for sacred art that was viewed during these two contexts in the Roman Catholic calendar. At different times in this calendar, different stories became more or less salient. Jesus' crucifixion at Easter versus a Sunday in July. We selected artworks that depicted religious stories related to Jesus' life, focusing on events surrounding his trial, execution, and resurrection. These events are typically emphasized during the 40-day Christian season of Lent. That culminates in the celebration of Easter. You all know that. Thus, Lent served as our temporally congruent context, and ordinary time served as our temporally incongruent condition or context. By conducting this study at a Catholic university, we were able to recruit a sample that had substantial prior knowledge, or at least exposure to, both the depicted stories and the different times of the liturgical year. Thus, temporal context here was easily identified and our participants were embedded in the changing religious seasons, more or less. So for this experiment, now one of the problems we had is that we can't actually move works around or move them to different times of the year. So we viewed participants, and it was during COVID when we first started this, so that was an additional layer of issues here. Participants viewed photographs of 2 existing art installations on the campus. So first of all, I'm going to say we also used eye tracking in this process. So this is a reference to that, and I'll come back to that. So the first set of images was this set from Luigi Gregory's Stations of the Cross. It's a late 19th century set of stations, very beautiful and very large, and they're mounted in our Basilica of the Sacred Heart. 14 panels in oil that pictorially depicted the Passion of Christ. This work, of course, is representational, with its depictions being easily recognized due to the resemblance to the physical counterparts. By contrast to this, we chose another set of stations, so-called, Philip Ricky's Life of Christ, Cycle of Life. That's located in an outdoor setting in our sculpture park in the university, composed of 70 stone megaliths in 8 scenes and set into this natural landscape. So here we are. So they're related to each other because they're both, in some ways, Stations of the Cross, but they're radically different from one another. And then one is, you might say, non-representational, and the other one is very traditional. Now, to solve the problem, we were also looking, in fact, at a couple of other things. I'm going to come back to that in a minute, is that we're also thinking about changing a spatial context, but that's another story. But for the moment, when we're looking still at temporal context, we photographed each of these rather than working in the wild and put them on a white background with a short title and added at the bottom of the screen to identify each depicted event. These titles were used to disambiguate the event and narrative being depicted and to serve as a reference for later memory tests. The 22 art pieces were presented one after the other. Representational paintings and abstract sculptures were then presented in separate blocks in counterbalanced ordered across participants. Because the artworks depicted sequences of events in chronological narrative, within each block of stimuli were presented in the order in which the depicted events occurred, rather than in some randomized order. Okay. In another experiment, I'm just going to show you this now, the backgrounds of the photos were also then manipulated to suggest some kind of spatial incongruity. I'll come back to this. So we have this. This is the Notre Dame football stadium. And I should have really put this over Touched on Jesus. That would have been much better, but I didn't. So, or we used a casino. So this was another example. Now, subjects were connected to eye tracking devices to measure the duration, the focus, and the character of their gaze. They were asked questions while viewing each piece. They were asked about the art. Perceptual questions focused on surface details. How many halos are there in the painting? Or what color is the stone representing the cross? Others on gist interpretation. Well, what do you think the standing pillars in the scene represent? They were prompted to self-report their own engagement with the art. How emotionally engaging do you find this painting or sculpture? How beautiful do you find it? As well as an estimate of how much they think other people would be engaged by the art. Using a 0 to 100 Likert scale, we asked about autobiographical memories of the experience with a piece of art. Were you spontaneously reminded of a personal event from your life by the artwork? We asked about remembered feelings of engagement when a piece of art was viewed, and then later, how that personal impact was remembered. Conclusion, temporal. We discovered that a congruent temporal context, i.e. Lent, led to more active semantic knowledge that aided memory encoding and retention. And that was the case for perceptual details of the art. These results suggest that priming semantic knowledge through temporal context leads encoding to focus on low-level information as opposed to the processing of more complex information. Overall, these findings suggest that temporal context does influence cognition, but to a limited extent. Now, while our main focus was on the effects of temporal context, we observed higher self-reported engagement with the representational than with the abstract art. This difference is consistent with other research and may occur because the higher level of cognitive effort required to understand what an abstract piece is about. At the same time, this effort may serve as a form of desirable difficulty that supports learning, comprehension, and memory. Indeed, just memory was better for abstract art, suggesting that the increased effort led to more people making more effort to decode the meaning conveyed by the abstract art than generated by the representation. In other words, they had to spend more time thinking about it, and they remembered it better several days later. They sort of knew what they thought the representational art showed them. The viewer is then required to participate in the meaning-making process at a different or deeper level because the ambiguity of the art puts more demands on him or her. The second exercise was about spatial context. This is where we're getting back to this. Here we expected that spatial context thematically, when spatial context thematically matches the materials being viewed, i.e. they're congruent, then cognitive processes will be different compared to when they do not. So if you're a chapel or an office or a museum. Thus, our focus was on how aspects of a person's spatial context influences the processing of materials within the context. We had two primary foci of such context influencing processes. These were A, the processing of items themselves, and B, the person's reported experience at the time. The processing of the items was measured in terms of people's ratings of how beautiful they perceived the artwork, how emotionally engaging they felt it to be, and in regard to their influence. And B, the influence of people were assessed by whether there was any spontaneous involuntary autobiographical memories that were elicited by viewing the painting. Specifically, here we address the rate at which viewing paintings triggered such memories and how this was influenced by spatial context. So first, we assess the experience of art in two very different physical locations, an office and a chapel. 150 Notre Dame undergraduates, a pretty homogeneous group, were presented with two kinds of art, half for sacred and half for secular. So a Madonna and Child versus an image of a man walking on the moon. Because paintings can't be moved, unfortunately, each piece was placed on a gray background and included a short title below the painting and digitally displayed on a 13-inch touchscreen tablet. A large majority of our students obviously identified as Roman Catholic, but 22 of the 150 reported they were non-Catholic, 5 selected other, 14 selected none, and 78 participants were tested in the chapel condition and 72 in the office condition. The students reported ratings of the experience of the art itself, as well as reporting any involuntary autobiographical memories they may have experienced while viewing the art. To emphasize the spatial context, prior to viewing the art pieces, participants were asked to verbally provide 3 words or phrases that captured what they thought about the space and how they felt about being in a space. After this, the viewers were handed the tablet in which the sacred and secular art pieces were presented one after the other in a random order. Participants viewed each painting for approximately 10 seconds and then were asked a series of questions, and they were asked to self-report their individual experience. For each painting, they rated the beauty of the painting from 1 to 7, how emotionally engaging it was from 1 to 7, and the positivity of the painting, from being positive to extremely negative, neutral, or whatever. Next, participants were probed about any involuntary autobiographical memories they may have had. I won't go into this too much detail, but for each reported involuntary autobiographical memory, they were asked an additional 16 questions after all the images were presented. These questions assess the vividness of the memory. as, I remember the event. I can see it in my mind. I remember the event. I feel as though I'm still reliving that original event. Finally, participants were given 3 questionnaires. These included the Art Experience Questionnaire, Anjan Chatterjee, the Centrality of Religiosity Scale, and the Desire for Aesthetic Scale. They were designed to reveal the extent to which students or subjects prioritize aesthetically pleasing things in their environment, the importance of religion to their personality, and senses of self, and experience with art by measuring the time they dedicate to art-based activities. So, experiment 2 was a bit of a replication of experiment one with 2 primary differences. First, rather than using physical locations of a chapel and an office, the subjects were presented with artwork in a virtual environment. This was done to allow for the basic structure of environments to be the same while their thematic content differed. Second, while using 2 locations from experiment 1, while we used 2 in experiment 1, we used 3 in experiment 2. These were a church, a museum, and a warehouse. So we recruited 285 undergraduates from Notre Dame's Department of Psychology participant pool. They got credit. And again, a large majority identified as Roman Catholic. 100 participants used the church condition, 85 the warehouse condition, and 100 in the museum condition. Now here's the problem. Because we couldn't move these museums, we decided to create virtual reality experiences. So we created a kind of, here's the church condition, here's the warehouse condition, and here's the museum condition. And we created the altar, the information booth, and also the warehouse supervisor's desk, perhaps, including soundtrack, people, maybe an organ playing, maybe people chattering in a museum setting, or maybe a forklift moving around in the warehouse condition. We then populated these walls with artworks, and students really walked through these spaces, and we did eye tracking devices and everything else to measure the amount of blinking, the length of duration of their look, the time they spent gazing, and so forth at the different museums and different pieces that hang on these walls. So the participants viewed the same 24 paintings as those in experiment 1, but this time in this virtual environment. Within this simulation, paintings were placed on gray walls with protruding dividers on each side to block participants' view of other paintings. Each virtual reality environment used the same cross-shaped layout. Total travel distance between paintings was the same. However, the interior decoration changed dramatically for each environment. Okay, I would just describe that. Going through this. So, again, as I said, subjects were connected to eye tracking devices to measure the duration, focus, and character of their gaze. Results. The experience of art is shaped by the context in which it is encountered. Art is more likely to evoke more spontaneous autobiographical memories when presented in unexpected spatial contexts, but stronger ones in congruent spatial contexts. So they had more reported spontaneous autobiographical memories in the non-congruent, like in an office, but they had stronger ones in the congruent space, like a chapel. In terms of subject matter and style, we learned that people tend to recall details of abstract artworks in the long term better than those in representational works, even though they generally prefer the representational to the abstract. The extra effort expended in processing the abstract works made them stick more firmly in the memory. In addition, the temporal context of viewing also affects the quality of the viewer's experience and the memory of the artwork. In sum, we have discovered that a viewer's spiritual cognition of sacred artworks depends to a significant extent on the work's content and style, as well as where, its space, its environment, and when it is encountered. impact. Museum curators and designers of liturgical spaces, psychologists and theologians will maybe draw some helpful information from this. How viewers derive and maintain spiritual meaning from encounters with sacred art, and how the spatial context, temporal frame, and formal elements of the works themselves contribute to it. In the end, though, I have to say, I found my biggest question was, when did this stop being art? And when did it become something other than art? So when it's projected on a tablet, or it's projected in an artificial environment like this, and it's encountered in a virtual reality setting, I started having serious doubts that we were really measuring encounters with sacred art at all. And in fact, with something else. But that was we're still working. I should say, there's still experiments going on. Our camp has ended. But our psychologists are still working away. One of them just moved to Baylor to be the Dean of Arts and Sciences. So I don't know what's going to happen with that. But J.A. Radvansky is still very interested in another question, which is how a prior experience of a piece of art influences the subsequent experiences of that piece of art. And we've moved now to working with the museum and walking students through this and measuring their memory, their reported experiences of art, both immediately after they see it and some days later, to see how the viewing of one piece of work in some sense changes and affects the subsequent viewing of the next piece of art. It's another story, but anyway, there we go.
Thank you. Can you, Matthew, can you sit? I think we can have an open session now for any questions for Robin or Matthew. Matthew.
Right.
Perfect time for dinner.
Yes, sir.
Matthew, I wanted to ask you about the trajectory on the recognition of beauty and the sort of making of meaning. I noticed a significant drop off every time they entered the entryway to the building. Are any architects in the room worried about this?
Well, let me also maybe point to Milton's diagram. Let me point to Milton's diagram. Some of that's by maybe we don't want that to be beautiful. Number two, right? Remember, we're a high space, we come to a low space, so we come out of there. So some of that is narratival storytelling in architectural form. So maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, but it maybe is intentional in a very effective way. But I would want somebody, at least in the front door, want to be more excited about going in, let's say.
Thank you. Do I need to? Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. Thank you. I think my question is about the word beauty or beautiful. Do you actually, well, for both of you, because also Matthew, you used beautiful also, and like, do you define, do you tell them what is beautiful or what consists as beauty, or I don't know, like I have a problem with the word beauty because I don't use it in my.
Well, I have a problem with the word Judy too, as many
Yes.
people know I do, but we don't define it for them. So that's a question that we ask. As you will hear probably tomorrow, I have a lot of discomfort with some levels of these experiments that we did. And one of them is some of the questions we asked. And another thing is just what are we doing with projected images, but that's another story. And so, yeah, I would say that I have some questions, but we use it as a question for them. We let them decide what they meant by it.
And we're the same case. Maybe I'll be the outlier here. I don't have a problem with word beauty. I love it. But we let them define it, and we find architects struggle with the word beauty because we know more in some ways, but people can intuitively know what beauty is without being able to define it. And we've seen this across, if you look at the trajectory of our graph, we have 180 people from a very diverse background, skill set, age, everything, all instinctually knowing what beauty is. the same way. And that to me begins to hint at, let me use some theological language here for my theologian friend, like there is an imago Dei here, right? There is a sense of people understand intuitively what objective beauty is. They could not define it for you, but they intuitively know, and we can see the consistency across that.
I just want to disagree.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, this is great.
Because I think that especially when we showed people we had all these different works of art running. So we had, I won't even try to describe them all, which would take forever. But they had different reactions. Not everybody thought the same works were beautiful and the same or in the same way. So there were people who didn't care for the works that other people thought were beautiful. So I think there wasn't consistent for us so much.
Before I'll take I think we people that were trained in architecture using the modern movement as a framework have been brainwashed about talking about beauty as a bad word. And we, regardless that I consider myself a modern or contemporary architect, we need to recognize that has been a shortcoming of our education. And we should not project that. That doesn't mean that resolves the question of what beauty is, but recognize that we are very negatively moved towards that. But and then you go.
This is for Matthew. One of the things you didn't point out in your drafts, but it appeared very apparent, was that when you got to the museum space, the delta between how the Protestants, the Catholics, and the non-religious people, shrunk,
Collapsed,
right?
Yeah.
It totally collapsed. Is there anything you want to say about that?
Is there anything you want to say about that, Julio?
No.
Certainly, I think that we bring in, as we've mentioned before, we bring in our worldviews to this. There is a perception of Christians in Christian space that has still understanding beauty, but it's understood in a different frame for different amplitude. That collapsed when the religious space became essentially an art space. Yeah.
And probably wasn't super clear, but when I started this project, and this was 7 years ago now, that was one of my main questions was, when you take a piece of religious art and you move it outside of a religious space and into a more secular space, be an office or a museum or a gallery space, my hunch was, and I think we were able to sort of show this, although maybe less than we hoped, is that people encounter it differently. They look at it formally, they're doing an assessment of the art historical principles and, its sense of aesthetic quality, but they don't necessarily have the same spiritual encounter with it. And so that's what I always wondered about museums with, what are we doing with these things? And can we actually, a museum with an icon, could you let a Greek Orthodox come up and kiss the icon? No, but they would want to.
Let me preface even before Anjan asked this question. I was speaking very loosely in my language for the broader audience.
Yeah.
Please ask.
Oh, you answered my question. To that last point, Robin, I was going to say that people's encounters with Martha Rothko and the Houston Chapel is very different than at the Metropolitan Museum, as an example of what you're talking about as something that is not at least explicitly representational. Mm-hmm. The question of beauty. So I have a narrow question for Matthew, and then just a comment about beauty, which is, it seemed to me that on those graphs, the first and the last points seem the same across most of that. So going through the space didn't actually change the external.
And we had this hypothesis that it would.
Right, which is what I would have expected, but it didn't happen.
It did not. Yeah, we were actually debating that yesterday. Why didn't we see this? Where was that? Yeah.
Yeah. So basically I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that, but since you're surprised.
Yeah, we were surprised too. We didn't. That's why we had people trek all the way back out to the front to do it again.
Yeah.
It was often a long walk.
Right.
We just didn't see it. Yeah.
And the one comment I had about beauty is that we've been looking at, so we typically now in our experiments ask those taxonomy questions, the 11 categories, and the way we do it.
But for the last 20 years, everybody in empirical aesthetics has asked liking, beauty, interest. That's like the standard that people do. And liking and beauty often correlate, but sometimes they separate. But what we're interested in is, are there different routes to beauty where you can have people, a group of people who rate beauty similarly on your Likert scale or whatever you're using, but the way they move through the taxonomy and arrive at beauty might be different, right? So there might be for some people, just a straight up kind of positive affect response might be what's really driving their judgment of beauty. And in other people, that kind of sense of immersion might be what's driving their sense of beauty. So a way to try to deconstruct what might be happening when people have an omnibus, as you say, a reaction that, people can say typically have an opinion whether they think something is beautiful, but maybe we can get underneath that a little bit.
That's why we thank you for your work. Gordon.
I just wanted to make a comment about beauty. It's partly to pick up on the idea that there's something problematic, and to focus just for a moment on beauty as an effective apprehension. The 18th century Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid discusses beauty and remarks that we use the term beautiful over a wide range of ontologically radically different things. So we can talk about a beautiful solution to a mathematical problem, a beautiful scientific theory, a beautiful face, beautiful tune, a beautiful landscape. And these radically different things are all properly qualified as beautiful, from which Reid concluded, beauty cannot then be something that we apprehend straightforwardly in a sensual sense. It has to be something different. What different thing could it be? His answer is that beauty is a judgment of excellence. So when I say that a solution to mathematical problem is a beautiful solution to the problem, I am making a judgment of its excellence as a solution. And similarly, if I describe an architectural feature as a beautiful solution to an architectural problem, then I'm judging its excellence. If that is true, then you need to ask about your 180 people. Are they in a position to make judgments of excellence or not? Because if not, when you say to them, is this beautiful? Whatever they say, whether they say yes, or they know, they may just mean, as Anjan was suggesting, I like that. But I like that is not a judgment of beauty. It's just a response. So I just say, if we think seriously about the concept of beauty, it's not at all obvious that what these people are apprehending is beauty. They're apprehending something, they're responding to something.
I would love to call in Wes here. Wes just published a book, Beauty's Lost.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to that for sure. I also think that sometimes we can get trapped inside really minimal understandings of beauty as certain kinds of relations of things, harmony, proportion, these sorts of things, rather than how just the form of things hits us in some sort of affective way, and I think what we're asking people to respond to is how does the form of this strike us, right? Is it something that evokes all sorts of things that you talk, words that you put up there, and I think we just think we need to be careful of narrowing beauty to whatever pleases us or whatever is pleasant. In the theological tradition, beauty is, if anything, beauty is what unselfs us, right? So that's much bigger than what pleases us. It's what disposes us to the good and to the true. And a beauty first approach, I think, is a great way of measuring these things, because it's beauty is what attracts us to want to do something or to want to know something.
first. Let's do Brandon, that he hasn't had a word.
Well, thank you both for your presentations. I really appreciated it. Thinking about the idea of the architect's intentions or the artist's intentions when they're creating a work, I guess one for Matthew and Julio in some regards, I was thinking about the original intentions of Christ Cathedral, the Crystal Cathedral as an evangelical space, right? And now it's been transformed to a Catholic space, and now Catholics are going to this. And so I guess one question is this a limitation versus choosing a building that was designed to be a Catholic space in terms of intentions? And then same with the artist regards, putting different religious art in different contexts makes me also think this relationship between context, intentionality, and what's really playing out, right? And do the architect's intentions always come about? We may intend to create some vast space or this compressive space to then have some release, like the Frank Lloyd Wright diagram, right, in Unity Temple, or what Gordon was talking a little bit about, where you may intend this with Roberto's presentation with his design, but maybe someone else without his explanation will not experience it in the exact same way, right? So it's more of a question. I'm just asking more broadly.
I want to jump back to Wes and come back to that, because one thing that I'm thinking is that we're testing people who haven't all that theological depth. So when we say beauty to them, they probably can mean anything, but they're not thinking it through. And so I'm sort of thinking about the fact that, one of the things that I was thinking about with your graph is that when they get to the museum, they're not looking for the same kind of experience. They're already primed to some other sort of experience of the art. I'm not sure that's answering your question, Brandon, but I'm thinking about what is the artist's intention. And until the Reformation, really, all of the art was pretty much in churches, right? It was like, that's where it was. And we had a funny experience. I'll tell a quick story of a statue of the Madonna and Child that was in our chapel, our theological department chapel, and it had been there for 25 years. And a new curator arrived for the museum and was doing an inventory of all the artwork in the university around, and he discovered that was a 13th century German Madonna. He scooped it up and took it away and put it in his museum, creating all sorts of chaos and anger and many, many memos. And I was in the middle of all of this, trying to defend the curator on one hand, and the function of this art was meant to be in a secular space as an artifact of 13th century Christian sculpture. So I don't know, what are the artist's intent?
Yeah. Let me address that one question about the Christ Cathedral. This was a deep consideration for us because, for those of you who know, it was Robert Schuller's evangelical space and has been converted to a Catholic space. It is, first consideration, we were looking at more modern architecture in comparison to the classical architecture in DC, and it's a striking example of sacred architecture. But we did feel that there was such an intentional conversion of that space to a Catholic space. And Sarah on our team did her dissertation in the transition from evangelical to Catholic space. We've got deep knowledge on that transition on the team. So it's very much in the present of our mind, but we felt comfortable that it's actually a good example of kind of a Catholic space, but also, it's not a typical evangelical space of Protestant evangelicalism today, right? So it's no one in the evangelical Protestant space would be like, that's self-identified, that's mine. Right, and if we can limit, and we limited the people who had never been there before, there was no resonant memory of I've worshipped in that space as a Protestant. So the combination plus the expertise and understanding that transition, we felt comfortable moving forward. It is a serious consideration, though. Yeah.
A quick comment about the beauty issue. It's going to matter a lot whether a view about emotion like the one Adam was describing ends up being correct. Because if that's right, then it may well be that feelings of being drawn to or attracted by or moved by an aesthetic object do themselves immediately represent it as beautiful and are indeed the very source of our concept of beauty, just as like color vision is the source of your color concepts. And if that's the case, then even if someone, all someone really is saying is I like it, well, in liking it, you're already representing it as beautiful on the level of your affective states. So if Adam's right, something like that is probably going to be true.
Okay, I think with that, we had to finish this